And God created the firstborn in his own image, an entity neither male nor female, dark nor light. A singular being that was both beautiful and terrible to behold. Disturbed by the power of his creation, God left it unfinished, banishing it to the abyss, forsaken and unloved. In its place, God started fresh, the slate wiped clean. He divided his next creation into two sexes, gave it intellect, reason, emotion. He gave it the gift of love. He gave it a soul. Biblical Apocrypha, Gnostic texts. For ages, the faithful among mankind have believed that humanity was God's first and only attempt at creating a being in his own image. They believe this because their sacred texts tell them that it is so. But they are wrong. Throughout history, a select few have learned of the existence of a creation that predates mankind, but their writings have been cast aside, branded as heretical for contradicting the teachings of Holy Scripture. In this way, a deadly truth has been unintentionally concealed from mankind. And that truth is this: that before Adam, before Eve, there was a being known as the Firstborn, God's first failed attempt at creating mankind. Unlike man, this creature was a being of singularity, encompassing all things in one perfect whole. Neither male nor female, dark nor light. Its perfection granted it a power far too great for God to abide. So he decided to get rid of it, lest its awful power unbalance creation. But God could not bring himself to destroy his first child, so he decided to banish it instead, carving a box out of reality to create an extra-dimensional prison known as the Pyxis. There, he sealed the firstborn away, leaving it unfinished, alone, and unloved. In its place, God created mankind, dividing his new creation into two sexes, and giving it flaws to maintain creation's balance. In addition, he gave his new creation several gifts, including the gifts of intelligence and emotion. Most important of all, however, was the gift of his love, the gift of an immortal soul. This gift marked mankind as favored in God's eyes, and would allow the virtuous among them to reside with God forever upon the deaths of their mortal bodies. But the firstborn was not content to sit idly by, while this new creation took what rightfully belonged to it. From inside the Pyxis, it watched as humanity was given all that it was denied, and grew jealous. As the ages passed and human civilization developed around it, the firstborn's hatred festered, gradually wearing away at the fabric of reality that made up the walls of its prison. Eventually, they would grow weak enough to allow a door to be opened from the mortal world into the Pyxis. Then, the firstborn could walk free and reclaim its place in creation by laying waste to mankind. All it needed was someone foolish enough to open the door. Sumeria 3000 BC. 5,000 years ago, it found just such a person in the Sumerian priestess Ereshkigal. Calling to the priestess through her dreams, the firstborn offered to grant Ereshkigal unimaginable power, if she agreed to set it free. This she did, and after learning the blood rites that would allow her to open the Pyxis, she raised an army of 10,000 men and marched them from their homes in the city of to a remote section of the desert known as the Rub al-Khali. There, on the site where her patron was first brought into this world, she ordered them to construct a massive temple city, the city of Alkali. Only here, where the Firstborn's presence had tainted the very earth, could the Pyxis be opened. When the city was complete, she gathered the men at the top of the temple and slaughtered them all. The negative karma released by their deaths acted as the fuel for Ereshkigal's spell, allowing her to tear a hole through reality and enter the Pyxis to greet her master face to face. But, unbeknownst to her, a group of 7 warrior priests had disguised themselves as members of her army to sneak across the desert and stop her from unleashing the Firstborn. Their leader, a man named Antidorunu, had been warned of Ereshkigal's intention and knew that if she were allowed to succeed, it would mean the end for all mankind. Together with his companions, the priest Enlil, Nana, and Utu, and the priestesses Inanna, Ki, and Nilil, Antidorunu tried to prevent Ereshkigal from opening the Pyxis, but was unable to stop her in time. Instead, he sent his companions into the Pyxis to delay their enemies while he remained behind to seal the breach. Calling upon the power of his very soul, Antidorunu began casting a spell that would close the door to the Pyxis and take the cursed city of Alkali with it. The sorcerer knew that the spell would ultimately claim his life, and so, before the warping of his soul tore his body apart, he used the last of his power to send a telepathic message back to his disciples in warning them of the Firstborn and the threat it posed to mankind. He then charged them with a sacred duty to establish an order of mystics that would watch over the breach in case others, desperate for power, should ever try to open it again. This order, he said, must keep 7 warrior priests at the ready, warriors who, like Antidorunu and his companions before them, could be called upon to battle the servants of the Firstborn and renew the seal holding it in place. With this final command, his message was complete, and, as the last of his life force ebbed away, his body was rent asunder. But reality follows different rules inside the Pyxis, and things like time and death have different meanings there. Antidorunu survived the death of his body, his soul remaining intact to watch over the seal it created. His companions, however, fared much worse. Upon their deaths, Ereshkigal called upon the power of her master to bring them back as demonic slaves, monstrous beings that now serve as her personal bodyguards. Ereshkigal knows that Antidorunu still lives, but she also knows that he is the only one that can repair his soul's seal if it is ever broken, and that, without his body, he is powerless. So, she has ordered her demon guards to collect the pieces of their old companion's body and place them inside 3 separate urns. One for the skin, one for the flesh, and one for the blood. When Antidorunu's disciples come to help him renew the seal, they'll have to resurrect his body first. And they'll have to fight their way through 6 powerful demons to get it. Meanwhile, in the world outside the Pyxis, time continued on as normal. Legends of the lost city of Alkali and the great power that lay buried beneath it spread across the world, tempting many to come looking for it and the dark secrets that it held. Conquerors came to claim the land around it, fighting, bleeding, and dying for something that they could not even be sure was there. After the Sumerians, the Greeks were the next to hold Alkali. but it was not until their successors, the Romans, came that the Firstborn would have another opportunity to escape. During the time of Rome, Alkali lay within a remote province far to the south and east, on the border of the Parthian Empire. Far from the influence of civilization and order, a posting at Alkali was considered by many to be tantamount to exile, a punishment reserved for criminals, outcasts, and the dishonored. It was also the domain of one of the most twisted officials in the entire Roman Empire, the depraved Governor Cassius Vicus. Once a tribune in Rome, Vicus was known throughout the empire for his love of hedonistic excess. He could be found in attendance at any extravagant party, feast, or orgy, and rumor had it that there were no perversion that he would not try at least once. His peers, however, did not always share his open-minded views, and when he was caught by surprise consuming human flesh, they agreed that he had finally gone too far. Vicus was condemned to death, but before his sentence could be carried out, the Emperor Tiberius, a personal friend of the tribune and a fellow reveler himself, interceded on his behalf. After the emperor's death, a short time later, his successor, Caligula, decided to appoint Vicus governor of Alkali. At first, it was suggested that this was a backhanded promotion, a way for Caligula to both recognize Tiberius's pardon and punish Vicus at the same time. Others, however, would later, and more accurately, assert that Caligula wanted Vicus as far away from Rome as possible so that he wouldn't compete with the emperor's own reputation for excess. Whatever the case, Vicus greatly resented his new appointment, until he realized just how liberating the position could truly be. Away from the eyes of Rome, Vicus was free to rule Alkali according to his own perverse whims. He soon became a cruel tyrant, earning the respect and fear of his neighbors throughout the region. The taxes his soldiers collected were used to fund his many monstrous appetites, and before long, the small frontier settlement of Alkali was transformed into a carnival of debauchery and gruesome spectacle. Meanwhile, back in Rome, a soldier named Tertius Longinus was also facing exile to Alkali, but, unlike Vicus, his crime was an act of virtue rather than one of perversion. A rising star in the Praetorian Guard, during the reign of Tiberius, Longinus's hopes for a life of honor and renown were dashed to pieces when Caligula rose to power. Under Caligula, he and the other guards were forced to take part in a wide range of atrocities, from the torture and execution of innocent civilians to bizarre orgies of sex and blood. On one such occasion, the emperor forced a senator's daughter to have intercourse with a group of men in addition to his favorite horse. Afterwards, the emperor claimed that the girl had not bled sufficiently enough, nor had she completely satisfied the horse. As punishment for this offense, he ordered Longinus to decapitate her, but Longinus refused. Outraged by his audacity, the emperor was ready to have Longinus killed as well, until the soldier's friend and protector Cassius Queron stepped in and begged Caligula to spare his friend's life in exchange for exile to Alkali. Amused by the thought of what would lie in store for the honorable guard under Vicus's employ, the emperor agreed, and so Longinus was sent to Alkali, where he became a centurion in the 1st Legion, 7th Cohort, 3rd Maniple, 2nd Century. At Alkali, Longinus and his men were tasked primarily with protecting the borders of the province and escorting merchant caravans as they made their way to the city. Frequently, however, the guards would be forced to either raid the caravans themselves or charge a protection fee for their services. proceeds from which would be transferred directly to Vicus's coffers without going through the usual taxable channels. During one of these raids, Longinus's unit was almost completely wiped out when a band of 6 mysterious strangers, each possessing unique magical abilities, stepped forward to defend the caravan. The leader of this group, a witch named Mavash, ordered her comrades to destroy their attackers, but keep Longinus alive. When the fighting was over, she told him that she and her cohorts were members of an ancient Sumerian order that had been charged with the stewardship of a powerful entity known as the Firstborn. This entity, she said, had been sealed beneath the city of Alkali long ago in order to prevent its corruption from spreading across the world. Now, however, Vicus's wicked actions were causing that seal to weaken, and before long, the creature would be released. She and her companions had joined the caravan to travel to Alkali and prepare for this dire event, but they had also joined because it was foretold that doing so would lead them to the 7th and final member of their team, Longinus, the unknowing bearer of a supernatural 6th sense. Confronted with this revelation, Longinus was struck with a renewed sense of purpose and immediately agreed to join Mavash's group. Together, the 7 warriors continued on their journey to Alkali and prepared themselves for the coming of the Firstborn. Meanwhile, back in the provincial capital, things were getting rapidly out of hand. The absolute power and unrelenting pleasure of his position was going straight to Vicus's head, to the point where he was beginning to see himself as a living god. It was at this time, when Vicus was ordering temples to be erected in his honor, that the Firstborn came to him, calling to him in his dreams and offering him power beyond his wildest imagination. Confused by the visions he was receiving, Vicus had a clairvoyant slave named Cassandra attempt to make contact with the entity in his dreams, whom he believed to be the god Jupiter in child form. Cassandra did as she was commanded and, after returning from her psychic journey, told the governor that the entity had given her instructions for a ritual that would open the doors to a paradise of endless parties. Understanding this as a call to join the gods in Elysium, Vicus agreed to perform the ritual, and soon enough, the Firstborn was free again. While the entity busied itself with the screaming citizens of Alkali, Longinus and the others disguised as guards in Vicus's court snuck past the Firstborn and into the Pyxis. Upon entering the breach, they found themselves flung 3,000 years into the past, to the lost temple of Alkali and the original opening of the rift. There they battled the demonic servants of Erexigal and resurrected Antidorunu, who told them that he would need their power to help him reseal the breach. Unfortunately, the Firstborn's release had tainted the land around the modern-day Alkali. So, in order to completely contain it, he would have to pull the Alkali of 38 AD into the Pyxis as well, adding another layer to the box and trapping the 7 mystics there for all time. Seeing no other alternative, the 7 companions agreed. The ritual was performed, and the Firstborn was sealed once again. It was not until much later, however, that the 7 came to truly understand the nature of their sacrifice. Trapped forever inside the Pyxis, they faced a losing battle against the many minions of the Firstborn, including Vicus. When they could no longer resist their enemies' assaults, the 7 warriors were captured and taken to see the governor, who had been transformed by the power of the Firstborn into a bloated cannibal fiend. There, they were tortured for Vicus's amusement, and later were forced to watch in horror as he devoured Mavash alive. Somehow, The witch managed to survive this process, living on inside of Vicus long enough to transfer her energy to him and turn him into the key to the Sumerian layer of the box. This transference brought an end to her existence through the dissipation of her life force. But her companions would not be afforded so easy an escape. Because of the ephemeral nature of death inside the Pyxis, they could be killed over and over again, and their bodies would be restored every time, providing Vicus with an unlimited source of entertainment. Such has been the fate of Tertius Longinus, who, for the past 2,000 years, has hung crucified on the outskirts of Vicus's domain, living and dying in an endless cycle of pain and suffering. Each time he is killed, his heart turns into a mass of flies, which then swarms into his mouth and resuscitates him. Thus he has remained, a grim reminder of the torments that await those who would dare to cross the Firstborn. Following the disappearance of the provincial capital, Al-Kali was taken by the Persians, who held the territory for the next 1,200 years. When it was finally taken from them, it was at the hands of the servants of the Firstborn, and in the name of holy war. In the early part of the 13th century, as the might of Christian Europe fought to wrest control of sacred Jerusalem from the Muslims, a young bishop named Malthius St. Clair was engaged in a desperate struggle of his own, a struggle for the fate of his immortal soul. For, despite his great success and his lofty position within the church, Malthius was secretly a deeply troubled man, a man burdened by the weight of unconfessed sins. Though he had always been pure in deed, in mind, Malthius was plagued by an immoral attraction to young children. For years he had denied the urge to act on this attraction, but, try as he might, he could not hold back forever. Eventually, Malthius gave in to his vice, and, once he could not gain control of it again. Malthius soon found, however, that indulging this vice did little to relieve him of the guilt and anxiety that gripped him. Convinced that his soul would one day be cast into the fires of eternal damnation, Malthius journeyed to the Vatican Library in Rome, where he hoped to find a solution among the church's vast collection of esoteric lore. There he found several texts referring to a being known as the Firstborn, a being so powerful that even its maker felt threatened by its presence. Surely, he thought, a being such as this would know of some way to save his immortal soul from perdition. All he would have to do was set it free. And so, armed with this knowledge, Malthius sought an audience with Pope Innocent III. When it was granted, he told His Holiness that he believed he had discovered the location of a gateway to the Garden of Eden, hidden beneath a city of infidels in the barren desert of Al-Kali. Incensed that such a holy place should lie within the hands of the Saracens, Malthius volunteered to lead a crusade to Al-Kali at once and take it back for all of Christendom. He then told the Pope that he knew of a secret weapon that would guarantee the crusade's success: the innocence of Christian children. According to Malthius, the purity of a child's faith made them invulnerable to the weapons of the heathens. With an army of such children at his command, he said, he could take Al-Kali with unparalleled swiftness. Swayed by the righteousness of his arguments, the Pope agreed to Malthius's proposal, and shortly thereafter, the crusade was approved. It is unknown whether Malthius truly believed the things he said that day, or if it was all just a clever ploy to arrange an easy sacrifice for the Firstborn. In the end, the truth matters little, for, whatever the case may be, Malthius received his army, made up of children from all across Europe who had volunteered to fight in Christ's name. Many of them were too weak to wear armor or use their weapons properly, but this did not lessen their faith. Regardless of what Malthus believed, the children knew that God would protect them. Such was the strength of their conviction. Accompanied by a small cadre of seasoned crusaders, the army traveled south to the coast of the Mediterranean, where they expected the waters to part for them like Moses at the Red Sea. When they did not, the crusaders were forced to wait for several months until they could arrange passage with one of the local merchants. Eventually, ships were provided for them, but not all of the ships would reach their intended destination. Racked by a storm at sea, 2 of the ships were destroyed, while several others were blown off course. These ships ended up in lands unknown, where the children were sold into slavery or prostitution to fund the crew's own efforts to survive. Those that did eventually make it to the Rub al-Khali forced a long and perilous march across the desert to reach the ancient city. Weakened by the voyage, many of the children died of thirst or heat stroke along the way. When they finally arrived at Al-Khali, Malthus ordered his remaining forces, still numbering in the tens of thousands, to construct a base of operations for their campaign. Using materials available from the surrounding ruins, they built on top of existing structures to create a fortress of les innocents, right above the entrance to the Firstborn's prison. Meanwhile, word of Malthus's activities reached the Order of the Knights Templar, who immediately began to suspect an ulterior motive for the bishop's crusade, for they counted among their number a special group of 7 warrior priests, knights blessed by God with the ability to perform miracles. These knights knew the legends of Al-Khali and had accepted it as their sacred duty to ensure that the city's secrets stayed buried. Labeled as blasphemers and heretics by Rome for the possession of their supernatural abilities, these knights had no reservations about opposing a papal-ordained crusade, especially with the fate of all humanity resting in the balance. Hoping to stop the conflict before enough blood had been shed, the knights set out at once to intercept Bishop St. Clair and his forces. But they were too late. 3 days before they arrived, Malthus ordered his army to attack. Still weary from the harsh journey and the strenuous labor that they had been forced to endure, many of the adult crusaders refused to participate. They called Malthus a lunatic for taking an army of children into battle. He in turn called them all cowards and questioned their faith in God. Ignoring their pleas to reconsider, Malthus led his children out onto the battlefield. When the Saracens saw the youthful army approaching, they were initially confused. After all, they did not wish to fight mere children. Instead, they urged Malthus to surrender, but when he refused, they saw no other choice. Their initial offer of peace rejected, the Saracens fought without mercy, sending over 10,000 children to their deaths that day. As their blood soaked into the ground, the Pyxis split open once again. Looking down upon the aftermath of the battlements of Les Innocents, the adult crusaders stood motionless, struck numb by the horrors they had witnessed. They watched as Malthus fled to the fortress's chapel to pray forgiveness for his sins, unable to muster the will to confront him themselves and demand justice. All they could do was go down to the battlefield and gather up the bodies for burial in the crypt beneath the fortress. But as they were taking the bodies into the crypt, something even more horrifying occurred. The skies above them darkened, and the bodies began to stir. Reanimated by the awful power of the Firstborn, the children rose to attack their former comrades with the fury of the vengeful dead. The Crusaders did their best to fight them off, but it was of no use, for they fought against an enemy that could not die. Meanwhile, Malthus, hearing noises from the crypt below, thought that God had heard his prayers and was returning his beloved children to him. He rushed down to the crypt to greet them, but found a rude surprise awaiting him instead. His screams echoed through the halls of Les Innocents for the next several days. By the time the Templars had arrived, Malthus had already been killed and resurrected as a powerful entity in his own right. Believing himself to be trapped in purgatory, Malthus thought that if he could lay the children's spirits to rest, he would finally be allowed into heaven. So consumed was he by the task he had set before him that he did not notice when the Templars snuck by. For their part, the Templars decided to leave well enough alone, sealing the entrance to the crypt and abandoning Malthus to his fate. From there, they entered the chapel where they found the entrance to the Roman layer of the box. Guided by the centurion Tertius Longinus, they found and defeated Vicus, then proceeded to the Cimmerian layer where they helped enter Darunu to renew the seal. They had hoped that, once their mission was complete, God would open the gates of paradise to them. But this did not occur. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside a reality that could only be described as hell. All around them, swarms of flies descended upon the bodies of the fallen Crusaders, swallowing them up and restoring them to a mockery of life as one of the Firstborn's monstrous toys. These revenants, retaining fragments of their former memories, immediately sought out and slew any Jews or Muslims still alive inside Alkali. Then, when there was no one else left to fight, they turned on each other. The Templars saw all this and came to the conclusion that the former Crusaders had been possessed by demons, and that it was their job to free them through the righteous word of God, or, failing that, a righteous blade. But no matter how many devil spawn they purified, the flies always brought them back, each time more monstrous and more ravenous than before. Eventually, the Templars gave up, barricading themselves inside Les Innocents until they could figure out what to do next. But the realization never came. Instead, the Templars were left on their own to face eternity in a realm where nothing ever changed, except to get worse. They could not age, they could not die. They never grew hungry or tired. It was as if they were trapped forever in a single moment in time. Faced with this grim reality, many of the knights lost their minds. Some turned on each other, calling each other heretics or madmen, while others turned on themselves, inflicting horrible wounds to atone for whatever sins may have consigned them to this fate. One by one they fell, either to their own blades or to those of the Crusaders or the children, until only two remained. Brother William of Auxerre, who was imprisoned in the dungeon as a lunatic and a blasphemer, and Sir Richard de Grey, who, despite it all, managed to hold on to his wits and his faith. The two of them are still there, inside Les Innocents, waiting for it all to end. They have been waiting for a very long time. After the Crusades, the area around Al-Khali returned to Muslim control and was considered a part of various Islamic empires until the Saudi dynasty claimed the region in the mid-18th century. Throughout these political transitions, the city was left largely undisturbed and would remain so until the early 1940s when Nazi occultists came looking for supernatural power. Beginning in the middle of the 1930s, the tensions in Europe already running high following the Nazis' rise to power, the Office of Strategic Services in Britain began to receive reports that the Germans, led by the occultists of the Thule Society, were investigating paranormal phenomenon with the potential for military applications. At first, these reports were dismissed as superstitious nonsense, but when further reports of inexplicable events during the Spanish Civil War were linked to the nationalist German allies, the OSS decided to pay a little more attention to what the Nazis were really up to. In truth, the Nazis were using the conflict in Spain as an opportunity to field test a newly developed unit known as the Geheimnisvolle Abwehrmacht, or Mysterious Defenders. This unit, made up entirely of supernatural gifted soldiers, was deployed on Spain's northern front where they posed as intelligence support for the Condor Legion to disguise their occult activities. On the field, their skills were employed to devastating effect. No target was safe from their assaults. Bombs would strike with unnerving accuracy, bullets would move around obstacles to reach hidden foes, and high-ranking Republican officials would die of heart attacks or spontaneous combustion inside their secure bunkers, slain from afar by unseen assassins. By the time the conflict was over, it was clear that the Germans had changed the nature of warfare, and that other nations would have to pursue paranormal investigations of their own if they wanted to keep up. Towards the end, Great Britain decided to consult the wisdom of their nation's foremost expert on the subject, the notorious occultist Aleister Crowley. Under Crowley's supervision, the OSS conducted a survey of its records, looking through field reports, psych evaluations, and other documents for indicators of soldiers displaying paranormal ability. Those that had were contacted, and, of these, the most promising candidates were selected to form an elite special forces unit that the OSS had dubbed Black Watch. For the next several months, these chosen few worked closely with Crowley to develop their supernatural talents, learning how to use magic to enhance their ammunition, correctly identify paranormal and psychic phenomenon, and make use of ancient relics to aid their efforts in battle. Meanwhile, the OSS began sharing information with the Americans who had recently formed their own supernatural intelligence agency, the Department of Occult Warfare. This agency, a covert division of the U.S. Army Chaplain Court, dealt primarily with data analysis, while Black Watch and the OSS handled fieldwork and information gathering. Together, the two organizations worked to get the Allied nations up to speed so that, by the time World War II broke out, they were ready to handle anything the Germans threw at them. And, as it turned out, the Germans were planning to unleash something truly apocalyptic in scope. While researching the Order of the Knights Templar for leads on the Holy Grail, members of the Thule Society came across a series of documents detailing the legend of the Firstborn and the Order's involvement at Al-Khali. Intrigued by the possibility of enlisting such a powerful entity towards their cause, the Germans sent a detachment of the Geheimnisvolle Abwehrmacht to investigate, led by the infamous psychic interrogator Hanna Lichthammer. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed model of Aryan perfection, Lichthammer earned her reputation during the Spanish Civil War, where she used her telepathic abilities to silently extract information from captured foes. More than this, however, Hanna was known for her overt sadomasochistic tendencies and her love of torture for torture's sake. She took great pleasure in the destruction of her victims' minds, often psychically manipulating them into committing horrible atrocities, while she just sat back and watched. Horror stories circulated throughout the Republican ranks, stories of mothers being forced to eat their own children, men cutting themselves open and pulling out their insides, and, to Lichthammer's credit, all of these stories were true. At Al-Khali, Lichthammer and her men were ordered to find the Sumerian temple spoken of in the legend. A psychic sweep of the area allowed them to pinpoint the source of the supernatural power emanating from beneath the sands, and, as fighting erupted in Europe, excavation of the ruins began. When news of their activities reached the OSS in Britain, a 7-man Black Watch squad under the command of Major Patrick Buckland was dispatched to neutralize Lichthammer and prevent the Germans from obtaining the secrets of Al-Khali. This in and of itself proved to be a relatively simple task. Lichthammer and her men were formidable opponents, to be sure, but they were ultimately no match for the battle-hardened veterans of Black Watch. It was what came next that proved to be the real challenge, for though the Germans had been defeated, Buckland's team had arrived too late. The door to the Pyxis had already been opened. From within, the Firstborn beckoned to them, its malevolence threatening to seep out into the world and infect the land like a disease. The 7 warriors knew, then, what had to be done. And so, with bravery and resignation, they stepped into the breach, suddenly finding themselves transported to the gates of a 13th century fortress beset by the undead. There they met Sir Richard, who recognized them as warriors of God and helped them to reach the next layer of the box. Then, like their predecessors before them, they fought their way through the layers of the Pyxis, resurrected onto Darunu, and lent him their powers to help him reseal the breach. And, like their predecessors before them, they were rewarded for their efforts with a one-way trip back to their frozen moment in time, to the eternal trenches of Al-Khali, where they wage an unceasing war against the fallen Nazi soldiers, and wait for the next group of heroes to pass through. Following the Germans' defeat at Al-Khali and the disappearance of Major Buckland's team, the DOW decided to take on a more active role in the occult warfare, training their own field agents and sending them out to accompany their British allies on missions of paranormal significance. At Al-Khali, members of both organizations came together to establish Outpost Vigil, a paranormal research facility dedicated to monitoring the dimensional rift and providing advance warning if it ever showed signs of opening again. 65 years later, it did. From its humble beginnings as a paranormal intelligence agency during World War II, the Department of Occult Warfare developed steadily over the next 65 years into the most powerful clandestine organization in the entire US military. Members of its Elite Special Forces Division, codenamed Jericho, were sent to take part in any conflict in which the United States was involved, working behind the scenes to protect the nation and its citizens from threats both supernatural and mundane. Korea, Vietnam, both Gulf Wars, Jericho was there for all of them, as well as for a few whose names will never be known by the general public. Based out of a series of rundown buildings tucked away behind the Army Chaplaincy Training School in South Carolina, the military arm of the DOW takes its name from the biblical story of the Battle of Jericho, in which 7 priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant circled the city once a day for 7 days. On the final day, they circled the city 7 times, and, after the 7th revolution, blew a mighty blast on the horns of a ram, releasing the power of the Ark and bringing the walls of the city crumbling to the ground. Just as the priests in the story, every Jericho operative is assigned to a team of 7 individuals, each one a specialist in one of the psionic or occult arts. They come from a variety of different backgrounds, though most of them have some form of military training and all share a distinct lack of immediate family. The department prefers things this way. No one to miss them, no one to ask questions. All of them are made to undergo an extremely demanding physical and mental training regimen, and each one must pass a thorough psychological examination before being placed on a team. Once a team is formed, those 7 individuals become each other's entire world. Unless they are assigned to work together, no team will ever meet another Jericho operative, and the only clue that other teams exist is the number their team is assigned. Outfitted with the most advanced technology that the military has available, the Jericho squads work to fulfill 3 major directives. 1. Advise and provide intelligence to the U.S. intelligence community through the use of psionics and other occult means. 2. Defend the United States and its allies from threats classified as paranormal, extraterrestrial, or beyond the scope of perceived reality. 3. Remain on constant 24-hour alert in the event of Operation Godseal. Though it is the primary reason for their existence, the members of Jericho are never told exactly what Directive 3 is, only that it exists. Information on Operation Godseal is extremely classified, and is given out only on a need-to-know basis. Now, thanks to the actions of a former Jericho operative named Arnold Leach, knowledge of that information is about to become necessary for humanity's very survival. Recruited as an invoker in 1962, Arnold Leach was a young talented caster with an insatiable hunger for power. Prior to joining the department, Leach spent his free time collecting and studying books of forbidden lore, and had already acquired considerable skill in calling up eldritch beings from before the time of man. With the training and resources made available to him by the DOW, he rapidly developed into a summoner of unrivaled power. However, over the next 2 decades, it gradually became clear that Leach was becoming more of a threat to the department than an asset. His unhealthy obsession with ancient powers and his complete disregard for others became apparent when his selfish actions caused a series of missions to end in catastrophic failure. Officially, Leach was expelled from the DOW. Unofficially, he was marked for assassination. But Leach was a charismatic man, and despite his dismissal, he managed to retain several allies within the department. These allies warned him of the danger that was coming his way, so that when the Jericho squad finally caught up with him in a crowded shopping mall in Dallas, he was ready for them. Among hundreds of innocent civilians, he unleashed a spell that shredded the fabric of local space-time, opening gateways to other dimensions and allowing unspeakable abominations to step through. Multiple Jericho operatives lost their lives in the carnage that ensued. By the time the survivors got the situation under control, Leach was gone, presumed to be either dead or trapped in another plane of reality, a victim of his own spell. Then, a few years later, a group known as the Brotherhood of the Dark Rapture emerged. Initially dismissed as just another fringe apocalyptic sect, the Brotherhood came to the DOW's attention after committing a string of brutal ritual murders and mass terrorist attacks all over the world. At first, these attacks appeared to be completely random. None of the victims had any relation to each other, and the targets of the large-scale bombings and gas attacks were in no way politically or strategically significant. Members of the group were known to possess both mental and supernatural ability, but no curses or invocations of any type were associated with the killings. Then, after a long and exhaustive investigation, the DOW finally found the key that started bringing the pieces of the puzzle together. Arnold Leach, the driving force behind the Brotherhood and the mastermind of all of its atrocities. After the failed attempt on his life in Dallas, Leach had gone into hiding, staying under the radar to encourage the belief that he had perished. While in hiding, he learned of the existence of the Firstborn, and knew at once that gaining this entity's favor would be his ticket to greatness. Quietly, he gathered a group of followers, like-minded occultists that were easily swayed by his promises of power. Over the next 20 years, these cultists zealously committed murder after murder in the name of the Firstborn, waiting for the day when their master would walk free and welcome them to its side. But in order to achieve this dark rapture, the Brotherhood would have to cause a massive release of negative karma at a specific location among the ruins of Al-Khali, a 7-point intersection of ley lines that marks the entrance to the Firstborn's prison. From studying the legends and history of the ruined city, Leech knew that such a release was typically achieved by slaughtering thousands of people above the intersection. But in modern times, it would be almost impossible to get that many people there at once, especially with the DOW sitting right there on top of the dimensional fault. Leech, however, was a tantric caster, able to absorb karma and store it for later use. With this in mind, he carefully orchestrated a campaign of ritual murders, each one precisely timed and located to maximize the output of negative karma. Multiple murders in Baltimore, gas attacks in Sydney, a school bombing in London. Leech was sure to be present at each and every one, gradually building his karmic charge until he had accumulated enough to achieve his goals. 2 days ago, after 20 years of buildup, the Brotherhood finally made its move. Under cover of darkness, Leech led his entire cult, numbering almost 200 individuals, on a raid of Outpost Vigil. Because it was built primarily as a research and surveillance station, the staff at Outpost Vigil was not equipped to handle an attack of this scale, and as a result was quickly overrun. However, before Leech could shut down their communication systems, Agent Muriel Green, the DOW agent in charge of Operation Vigil, managed to get an emergency transmission out to the CIA headquarters in Langley, informing them of the Brotherhood's attack and requesting immediate reinforcements. Remote viewers stationed at Langley were able to get some psychographic images of the situation before Leech blocked them out, but from what they could see, it was difficult to say for sure exactly what the Brotherhood was doing there. After all, if they were hoping to free the Firstborn, they'd need a lot more than just 200 warm bodies. Meanwhile, back at the facility, Leech and his men had located the intersection and were getting ready to perform the ritual required to open the box. When everything was ready, the cultists took their places over the dimensional fault and, following Leech's careful direction, began inflicting horrible wounds on themselves and their fellows, letting their blood flow freely and their screams of agony fill the air. As the ritual progressed, chemical and bacteriological weapons were released to improve the quality of their suffering. Then, at the height of their torment, the cultists began taking their own lives, sending a rush of negative karma towards the waiting Arnold Leech. Finally, after everyone else had died, Leech committed suicide as well, and with his dying breath, all of the karma he had accumulated over the last 20 years was released in a single wave of terrible power. In its wake, only silence remained. At approximately 0400 GMT, every sensitive in the world felt a sudden shock as a wave of psychic anguish passed through them. US satellites monitoring oil pipelines in the Rub Al-Khali picked up an enormous discharge of thermokinetic energy, and further investigation revealed that an electromagnetic pulse had knocked out all communications in the region. 2 Navy F-16 fighter jets stationed on a carrier in the Red Sea were sent to get a better look at the pulse's epicenter, but were lost inside an impenetrable sandstorm that had suddenly engulfed the area. Elsewhere in the world, a series of bizarre phenomena hinted at the dreadful events that had just taken place. Beaches across the Mediterranean choked with dead sea life. entire flocks of birds falling dead from the sky, young children throughout the Fertile Crescent suddenly struck with inexplicable seizures and cases of hysteria. By 0900 GMT, the omens were clear. A simple message sent to both the U.S. Special Operations Command and the Department of Occult Warfare said it all. Code Jericho. The box is back. This is not a drill. Immediately after receiving the message, the DOW dispatched Jericho Team 23 under the command of Captain Devin Ross to fly to Outpost Vigil, find any survivors, and either prevent the Brotherhood from achieving their goals or undo any damage they'd already done. Nothing has yet been said about Directive 3 or Operation Godseal, but Father Paul Rawlings, a senior team member who worked with Leech back in the 60s, knows the legend of the Firstborn, fears that they may already be too late. And his fears are well justified. Leech and his men were indeed successful in their attempt to open the breach, and have already been restored to inhuman life by the grace of their dark patron. Thanks to his contacts at the DOW, Leech already knows that Ross's team is coming, and he waits for them with open arms. For, in truth, his patron is not yet entirely free, and it needs something that only the Jericho team can provide to complete its escape. According to the legend, the Firstborn will attempt to escape 7 times throughout history. On the 7th attempt, it will either gain the freedom it so desperately desires or be locked away forever. This, however, is a misrepresentation of the truth. In reality, the cycle of breaches will continue until the Firstborn is either permanently destroyed or finds a way to get what it wants. And what it wants, more than anything, is the one thing its creator refused to give it: an immortal soul. With a soul of its own, the Firstborn would finally be able to escape the bounds of the Pyxis, but in order to attain one, it has to absorb the power of 7 mystic warriors. Each time the breach has been opened, 7 mystic warriors have appeared to thwart the Firstborn's efforts, but each time they do, Enter Darunu seals it away again before it has the chance to absorb their powers. So, this time, it has decided on a change of tactics. Just as it has called before to those who would seek to see it free, now it calls to one who would seal it away again. Captain Ross, leader of the Jericho team. If it can lure Captain Ross and the others past Anta Darunu and into the Pyxis Prima, the bottommost layer of the box, and the site of its original creation, it will have the chance to absorb their powers, and from them craft a soul of its own. The 7 members of Jericho Team 23 are currently en route to Al-Khali, where they will make contact with Lieutenant Colonel Acklin on the Swiss Guard. For the past day and a half, Acklin and his men have maintained a defensive perimeter around the city and the unnatural sandstorm that surrounds it. From there, they will help the Jericho squad find a way to get inside the ruins. But after that, they're on their own. If the team is to complete its mission, it must act quickly. The political climate in the region is already one step away from meltdown, and the DOW fears that mishandling the situation in any way could provide the spark that ignites the keg. Furthermore, the longer the breach stays open, the further the Firstborn's corruption will spread. Within a week, it will reach out to encompass the entire globe, and all the world will become a hell just like the Pyxis. The members of Jericho must find a way to close the breach before this can happen, but doing so means trapping themselves forever with the very evils they're fighting to contain. 4 groups before them have made that sacrifice. Will they choose a different course? Or Will they fall prey to the Firstborn's minions before they even get the chance? If you're resigned to your fate, time to subscribe to your fears.
Come play with us forever.